Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we are in round 4 of the 2016 Candidates Tournament. Winner of this tournament goes on to face Magnus Carlsen in November for the World Championship. Now we have 3 players tied for first. Sergei Karjakin, Vishy Anand, and Levan Aronian. All 3 of those players have 1 win and 2 ties. And in round 4, we have 2 of those competitors facing off. White's going to be played today by Sergei Karjakin, and Black's going to be played by Vishy Anand, winner of the last Candidates Tournament. So definitely some powerhouses facing off today. Karjakin starts out with knight f3, pawn d5, pawn e3, knight f6, and then pawn c4. And this can go a few different ways. Could kind of play like an English opening here with pawn c4. Could eventually transpose into just the queen's gambit with pawn here to d4. So a lot of different options. Both sides are kind of leaving it open. Pawn to e6, so kind of going for that queen's gambit decline line if we do see a pawn here to d4. Instead to see pawn b3, something not super common, but more typically aligned with the English opening. Pawn to b3, a bishop here to b2, getting ready to get this dark square bishop involved into the game since it's kind of blocked out by the pawn here on e3, and then just getting here knight to c3, or later on pawn to d4, knight to d2 is also a possibility for white. Bishop e7. Bishop b2, as we talked about, castle on the king side, knight to c3. So deciding to go ahead and attack the center of the board. Pawn c5, pawn takes on d5. Decided does not want to go ahead and play bishop here to e2. Allow his opponent to come here, take here on c4, wants to go ahead and take this central square here on d5 instead. So pawn takes on d5, knight recaptures. Me personally, if you're looking for kind of how I would play and how I recommend a lot of players play, is pawn takes on d5. Both are going to be completely fine. I do like controlling the center of the board with my pawns a little bit early on, and also opening up the door for my light square bishop for black. A lot of times for white, you have the dark square bishop. It's very hard to get involved into the game. 20 moves in and you haven't moved it at all. For black, it's a light square bishop right here. And so if you play knight takes on d5, it's a little bit tougher to get your light square bishop involved into the game. Now, higher levels of chess, they're always going to find creative ways to get that involved. But if you kind of look at it and you say, could I take with my pawn or my knight? One option is to just go ahead and take with a pawn. I think that's completely fine. But decides to go and take with his knights right here. Queen to c2. Just completing development a little bit. Knight to c6, pawn to h4, and this is a pretty interesting move. I really expected bishop e2, castle on the king side, pawn here to h3 potentially, just maybe trying to thwart some attack later on, but pawn to h4 is pretty aggressive, looking to start to push on the king side of the board. Still probably a little tricky with the c file semi-open right here to castle on the queen side, but pawn to h4 definitely saying that he's looking to attack on the king side of the board. Now b6 and then a3 just trying to hold down this b4 square, very potent for both the knights to come here, would be a nice little outpost. So pawn to a3 is kind of stopping that. And then pawn to f5. So Vishy Anand trying to strike back a little bit in the center of the board, since he does see this pawn to h4. Does not want to be the one just kind of sitting back, does want to attack aggressively. Bishop here to b5, attacking the knight, getting ready to castle on the king side if he would like to. Bishop to b7, so after the pawn to b6, solidifying this pawn chain, he can now bring his bishop out here, defend both the knight and try to control this light square diagonal right here. The knight's now going to take on d5, and then the pawn recaptures. Didn't want to do this right away. This would allow his opponent to kind of extend his light square bishop along this diagonal right here, but once he played bishop to b7, he recognized that he could go ahead and exchange here if he wanted to, and after pawn to d5, the light square bishop would have to come back to c8 to kind of control this. So, Sergei doing a good job of kind of waiting to see what his opponent does, and then exchange those knights here. He does want to exchange that knight as well, because he wants to open up the door for this light square bishop to really, really control this long diagonal right here. It's kind of blocked off by that knight there on c3. Now it's time to go ahead and get this pawn involved. So pawn here to d4, trying to control the center with backup by the bishop on b2. Rook to c8. The pawn can't take, because if the pawn were to take, all of a sudden we see bishop take. The bishop can't take back, because then the queen's just going to take. So because of that, black is kind of forced to, instead of take, play his rook over here to c8 first to kind of protect it. So now if he wants to, he could take with his pawn right here. But we see Karjakin decide he wants to go ahead and take right here. Again, open up the door for his dark square bishop to kind of control. After the pawn takes, we do see castle on the king side. Now bishop to f6, just trying to make sure that white does not completely dominate this long diagonal right here. And it wasn't doing too much here on e7, just getting ready for black to castle on the king side. But since it does that, wants to get a more aggressive spot. Rook over here to d1. This is kind of interesting because the bishop here on f6 is attacking the pawn here on h4. This queen here on d8 is both protecting this and attacking this, and white only has one defense here. So it kind of looks like black could take with bishop to h4. But it gets pretty tricky here because it's not actually as protected as he thinks. After rook to d5, the queen can't come down here and take on d5. That's going to be a mistake. Bishop to c4, pinning the queen down to the king. The queen is going to fall. Now if we come back here and say, well, what other options do we have? The queen is being under attack. We could see queen to e7. This is no longer under attack, and also still defending the square here on h4. But white can just take here on h4, and the queen can't actually take. If the queen were to take, so queen takes here on h4, then all of a sudden rook to d7, and this is pretty deadly. It's attacking both the bishop here on b7, but it's also threatening the rook to g7. That is a huge attack. This queen can also get involved. This bishop here on c4 can get involved. So it gets pretty tricky as far as how black really wants to respond. One option could be rook to f7, just trying to kind of block this off. But then we just see bishop to b4, pinning down this rook. The rook can't move. Potentially now the knight comes up here to d8, just adding another defender on the square here on f7. But then all of a sudden the bishop could take, the knight takes, and then the queen comes up here to f5, attacking the square right here. We still have the bishop over here, and this bishop right here is still under attack. Very, very difficult for black to deal with. If we come back a few moves on board and say, okay, what if the rook does not move there? What if instead we see another move, knight to e7? Okay, if he tries to do this, instead the rook can now first take on b7. Now rook to e8, trying to hold down this material. Bishop to c4, attacking the king. King over here, h8. Now queen to c3, a little bit different move, but attacking the square here on g7. This pawn can't move. It gets very difficult. Queen could come here to g5. Defending this square here on g7, but then pawn to f4 could just kick back to g6, but then all of a sudden queen e5 is very deadly, attacking this square right here. It doesn't really matter where black goes. All of a sudden the rook can come over here to e7. If we do see an exchange on board, the queen can just take right here. It's just going way down here. Black doesn't have much material at all. White on the other side has two bishops up here. It's very difficult for black to even stop an attack from here. So all in all, it's pretty deep. You have to get deep in the weeds to actually see what all is going down. But after this rook here to d1, this pawn here on h4 is actually surprisingly secure. The bishop can't really take it, and it's starting to put a lot of pressure on the center of the board here on d5. We see black play knight to e7, just putting more defense on the square on d5 as we talked about. Now we see the bishop take here on f6, and then rook to f6, capture back that material. Pawn to g3, just solidifying this pawn chain right here on the king side. Bishop a6, we do see an exchange on board, and then the rook comes over here to a6. And then queen to c3, and the queen has a few options. It could come to d3, to be honest, attacking the rook here on a6. c3 is completely fine. It does allow him to defend the square here on e5, so if he wants to bring his knight here, he does have that possibility. But in this particular case, both sides are fairly equal in material. no one really has a clear advantage. You know, black does control the center of the board here, but he does have kind of these two pawns, kind of hanging pawns in the center of the board. Those aren't really a strong pawn chain, so it's not really as big an advantage as just controlling the center. Early on, when you have tons of minor pieces helping control this, that's one thing. Later on, it's a little bit more difficult when you have kind of your major pieces. You want them to be a little bit more involved than trying to hang on to two hanging pawns in the center of the board. Rook here to b6, attacking this pawn right here. Doesn't have to worry about too much because it has the queen. Rook c1, attacking the semi-open file. Queen to d6, defending that square here on c5. Knight e5, as we talked about, just trying to plug up the center of the board. Rook here to b7. Both sides still fairly equal as far as material on board. And then knight to d3, pawn c4, pawn takes on c4, rook c4. Queen e5, which is a nice little move after the capture right here. And the rook takes, pawn to g6, solidifying this pawn chain, which kind of makes sense, but then rook here to c5. And the exchange that Karjakin kind of went through just kind of shows you how deep of an understanding that some of these players have going into the endgame. We looked at a position 7-8 moves ago that was fairly even. There was no real advantage for either side. And then a small little exchange on board where both sides, they didn't really gain material. But all of a sudden, white now has a clear advantage. Not necessarily on the material standpoint, but he has control of this board state. This rook here on b7 is more of a defensive square. This knight on e7 can't really move too much, can't come to c6 because the rook and the knight are attacking it, can't come past d5 or f5 because his own pawns are blocking it right now. Neither king is really involved into the action, but this pawn's going to be able to push a little bit more than this pawn here on a7, and he can really hold on to that a little bit more with his rook here. So white has a much more aggressive in-game, and so Vishy Anand, for right now, either has to wait for Sergey to kind of make a mistake or just try to hold on for a tie. We see king g7, rook to a5, just attacking the pawn here on a7 and still holding down the fort here on pawn d5. The knight can't really move because as soon as it moves, this pawn is going to fall. So this is kind of a stuck spot for the knight here on e7. King to f6, knight back here to d3, just trying to get in a little better position. Rook c7, rook a6, check. King's going to move. Knight to f4. Rook d7. Now the king starts to activate. King f1. Knight to g8. It's kind of tough too because the rook comes here to d7 to allow the knight to move, but the knight's kind of moving away from the board state, but there's no other great squares. Usually I would say, especially if you're down in material, you never want to get your knight away from the action. You want to keep it involved. But you can come to c8 if he wants to. I would clearly see that c6 would be a bad move. It would just be gobbled up. But c8, g8 kind of his only options, but neither of those even feel great if I kind of look at the board state. Knight to e6, check. King is forced to move, so king f7. Now knight here to d4, which kind of feels like where he wanted to be all along. Knight here to e7. And then he swings it over here to b5. So the outpost here on d4 allows him to come over here, attack this pawn here on a7. Knight c8, pawn a4. So all this, and then he kind of does the one extra move coming up the board state, which is exactly what he's going for. Rook b7, rook c6, attacking the knight. Knight's going to come back here to e7. And then we just kind of come back and forth a few moves. We have a twofold repetition. Sergey decided, okay, I can go ahead and go for the draw. If you have kind of the same board state 3 times in a row, threefold repetition is a drawn game. He looked at it and said, I have the advantage. I'm going to press this as much as I can. I don't want to draw here. So took a couple moves and then decided to go ahead and change it up a little bit. So he plays rook here to d6, attacking the pawn here. So now we kind of come back to a state where the knight can't really move. As soon as the knight moves, this pawn is going to fall. So it's kind of stuck right here. And then we see the fatal rook to b6. This is one of those where Vishy Anand, he just can't play rook here to b6. He has to kind of look at it and see that his 7th rank is just too valuable to give up. As soon as he moves, he's got to just sit there and hang on for a tie. A rook here to d7 is a complete dagger. As we talked about, the knight can't go anywhere, so it's just kind of pinned down right now. This pawn would be under attack. Also attacking this pawn, I think he thought, okay, after pawn here to a6, I can just hold on to it with my rook, and that's fine. I don't necessarily think that he looked at knight to c3. And this is where Vishy Anand decided to go ahead and resign in the game. The knight's going to come here to d6. It's going to go up a material. He has a clear advantage. At the end of the day, Sergei Karjakin is more than likely going to win the game. Now, personally, I wish that Vishy Anand would have played it out. I still think it's a tough endgame. So just so y'all can kind of see how crazy it would get, I'll kind of run through a series of moves just so you could see. Some people always ask, why would you, in this spot specifically, why would you just resign? I definitely wouldn't. I would try to see if my opponent makes a mistake. But rook e6, knight takes on d5, so we kind of know that's going to happen. Rook e5, rook takes on e7. We see an exchange on board. King takes right here. So white is up a pawn, but this is not an easy endgame. So we'll kind of go through the scenario where both sides are rushing their kings toward the center of the board. Black's probably going to get there first, so he's going to take over here on the king side, or the queen side. White's going to focus on the king side. So king e2, king d6, king d3, king c5, e4 needs to start attacking on the king side since he's not going to win the race over here. We see king b4, pawn g4, pawn takes check. King recaptures. King captures here on a4. So we do have a race here. Pawn f4, king b5. Now king d5, making sure there's no shenanigans going on. King a5, starting to push up the board. a4, pawn to f6. It didn't really matter if the pawn takes, just waste a move here. The pawn recaptures. We're going to essentially see the same thing here. But pawn a3, pawn f7, pawn a2. Queen to f8, so white does get there one move ahead. And so white does win. But for a lot of the fans out there that kind of wish Vishy Anand had gone through the motions, there's so many different ways that white could have made a mistake here. And he could have at least gotten a draw, if not a win by some miracle. But all in all, Vishy Anand kind of looked at, I think he was just upset with the fact that he gave up that 7th rank. And he resigned. So congratulations to Sergei Karjakin. He's in first place. Levon Aronian did have a draw, so Aronian is in second place, and then Vishy Anand kind of drops to that 3rd spot. Does have a win, but he also now has a loss as well. So 4 rounds in the books. This is a long tournament, so many, many rounds to come. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for round 5.